Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Mr. Melber, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Thank you for having me. My name is Henning Melber. I'm born in Germany. I grew up in Namibia and I came to Sweden in 2000. And among other things, I was the executive director of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation based in Uppsala, from where I'm also speaking now, between 2006 and 2012. And I would assume one of the reasons for this conversation is that I also published on Dag Hammarskjöld and that you would like to learn a bit more about the person, the Mensch Dag Hammarskjöld has been.
I've noticed a lot gets talked about his death, so I was interested more in learning about his life. But where did you first come across Dag Hammarskjöld?
Actually, during my childhood, I was 11 years when the news broke that the Secretary General of the United Nations was killed in a plane crash. I have very vague memories, and with memories, it's sometimes this issue, are they reinvented or are they real? But I firmly believe that those days when I passed on the way to school, the local newspaper, that I became aware of the newspaper clips which were on display outside of that newspaper, reporting on the death of Dag Hammarskjöld, inasmuch as I do vividly remember the assassination of JFK. There was not much more like that, but in my later life, I came across issues which relate to fundamental values and loyalty and personal integrity. And this is when I basically, in a conscious act, discovered Dag Hammarskjöld as a person who stood for values and norms and was not willing to compromise on fundamental principles he subscribed to. That was before I joined the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, not aware that I would end up there, which then became my last employment before retirement. And I felt it's the perfect way to end a professional career. And I always have this memory of Dag Hammarskjöld. There's a photo of him in a white suit posing ahead of the UN building in New York. To associate that with Gary Cooper in a suit, because that was the day in the late 50s, early 60s, where Gary Cooper was our hero when we watched the Western movies as kids of 10 or 11 years. So there's a mixture of early childhood-related memories, I believe, were there when it comes to Dag Hammarskjöld.
When you started to learn more about his values, maybe you can give me a little bit of a background about his upbringing and a little bit more about his early life before, obviously, he takes the main stage, in my opinion, on some serious political issues.
As of 3 years of age, since 1908, Dag Hammarskjöld was raised in the Uppsala Castle, which is until the very day the official seat of the local governor of the district of Uppland. His father was the governor there, Hjalmar Hammarskjöld, for many years. And Dag Hammarskjöld was brought up in the castle. He visited school and later university in Uppsala. And when he was appointed Secretary General of the United Nations, he was interviewed in a very famous radio program about what the person believes in. And he basically pointed to his upbringing and the values of his father as a committed Swedish civil servant. And to understand Hammarskjöld's way of acting, one need to go back into the values and principles of Swedish society emerging in the early 20th century. You had a new generation of civil servants who considered it the most noble task to serve the public good, to serve the people by being engaged in public administration. It has been a Swedish core value until rather recently. Only since the neoliberal times started that has changed. But almost throughout the 20th century, this was the core value. And Dag Hammarskjöld, from a very early age, had a private notebook which was posthumously discovered and published as markings. And if you go through these entries, starting from the 1920s, when he was just 20 years of age, beginning to study at Uppsala University, it's almost excruciating to follow his approach to life as a duty to serve. It's very painful to read those notes throughout his whole life. The last entry was a few weeks before his death at Dola. And it was always this kind of an inside battle. He was deeply spiritual, but this inside battle that you must continue life despite all the challenges and tasks, because that's your duty. Your life is a duty to serve. And that was internalized through this childhood and his initial years, because he then became a public servant in Swedish society. He served the Swedish social democratic government without ever joining a political party. He was never a party member of any political party, but he was one of the architects of the Swedish welfare state. He had studied, among others, languages, but also economics. He graduated in economics and got a PhD in economics with no one less than Gunnar Myrdal being his examiner. And they did not agree. But Myrdal, in his assessment, said, I don't agree with him, but this thesis is brilliant. And it's often overlooked that Dag Hammarskjöld had the mind also of a trained economist, which was visible, among others, that during the 1950s, as Secretary General, he declared that ECOSOC, for him, is the most important agency of the United Nations, the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. Now, that's a kind of a footnote. You will be aware during our conversation that I tend to get lost in footnotes. Let me return to the values and principles. Serving the public good, serving the best interest of the people is the ultimate reward for people that have been internalizing the values as Dag Hammarskjöld had. His father was a very conservative civil servant. And he, at the times of World War I, was also Prime Minister of Sweden. And he imposed, because of the strict neutrality principle of Sweden in World War I, to stop any ties with the outside world, which caused a shortage of food supply. So his nickname in Sweden became Hammarskjöld, because he was not compromising with his fundamental principles. And while in their political orientation, his son Dag and his father Hjalmar did not agree, Dag Hammarskjöld, in this interview I mentioned, made often reference to his father as the example for him how to serve the public good, to be loyal to principles and values and do not make compromises which would undermine or betray those principles. That was his moral compass, so to say. And when he subscribed as Secretary General to the Charter of the United Nations, it became for him like a Bible. And not by coincidence, a lot of people made reference to him as Secretary General of the United Nations, being the secular pope. For him, the clauses and principles of the United Nations Charter were the only relevant, acceptable guidelines when it came to normative values and principles. To the extent that during his years in office as Secretary General, he did not compromise on those principles, no matter from which side of the Cold War period the member states came who were tempted to betray those principles. To give you one example, and Dag Hammarskjöld was far from bragging. He had a close friend, Bobesco, a painter who also portrayed him. The most prominent paintings of Hammarskjöld are from Bobesco. And during all these sessions, they became close friends. And in a letter of 1960 to Bobesco, he attached a cartoon, which was one from the most prominent US-American newspapers, which pictured Nikita Khrushchev and the French president de Gaulle. And they both met, and in between of them was a tank, and Khrushchev was wearing a badge saying, "I don't like dark." And de Gaulle was wearing a badge saying, "I don't like dark either." And Hammarskjöld sent that cartoon to Bobesco with the comment, "If there are few things I'm really proud of, then this is one." Because it illustrated for him that he did not compromise for geostrategic interests. So coming back, the integrity of Hammarskjöld to what he considered to be fundamental values and principles was one of the utmost characterizing aspects of his personality, but also his diplomacy, which did not mean he couldn't compromise. When in pursuance and implementation of these principles, it was necessary to compromise, he was the first who was willing to do that in pursuance of the ultimate goal.
Do you believe he looked at the job as civil servant more of a belief factor for him rather than a job? A lot of people that get put in these positions, they look at things as just a job, but it seems like the way you're describing Dag Hammarskjöld, he's looking at it more like it's a belief or like a law in his own mind and in his own heart.
It was a calling, it was a mission. And that again was shared by many of his generation in Swedish society during the first half of the 20th century. It was an honor to be appointed as a civil servant. It was an honor and recognition if you were considered valuable enough to serve in a higher ranking position for the best interest of the state, being understood as the best interest of the people. I made reference to the Swedish welfare state, which was brought about in the 1930s and 1940s and established really a society which, until the end of the 20th century, made remarkable progress when it came to the social welfare of basically all Swedish citizens. That state of the 1930s and 1940s, meaning also, of course, the civil servants and the public administration, considered its task as one of a facilitator between capital and organized labor. And they managed in negotiations to establish something which was for a very long time almost a sacrosanct Swedish principle, one that you have to negotiate until you find common ground and an agreed solution between the parties. And the Swedish state of the time did achieve that. They introduced a reformist capitalist society where capitalism or capitalist interests were willing to recognize that it's also in their interest that profit maximization does not mean to make as much money as possible, but it means to strike a social contract with the workers who produce the wealth. As a result, you had, until the late 20th century, no strikes in Sweden because all was solved at the negotiating table. And you had one of the societies with the smallest differences in income. Meaning if you were a high-up manager in business, your salary was, of course, considerably higher as the one of a receptionist in that company. But it was still in a margin which these days of neoliberalism would be beyond imagination. That has changed in Sweden too. But to understand the generations to which Dag Hammarskjöld belonged, one needs to keep in mind the Swedish model of social development and formulating a social contract which takes on board everyone, that nobody feels left out, which also generated in Swedish society, actually until the very day, a very high degree of confidence and trust in the state. I'm coming from Germany by birth. That would be entirely impossible for Germany. Well, Germany had, of course, also a very different dark trajectory. So there are very good reasons for Germans not to trust their state. But I would also imagine it's similar to the USA, where you don't trust as a point of departure the state. You're suspicious. You feel, where are the pitfalls? What are they trying to lure us into? This is hardly existing in Sweden until the very day. Despite the fact that Swedish society is one which would meet the definition which was crafted by Michel Foucault of a disciplinary society. A lot of regulations, a lot of detailed clauses, what you have to abide to, what you must obey, and Swedes follow them. Swedish society today, if you stand at the tiller in a grocery shop and there are 20 people ahead of you and there is a very old person in front which takes too much time, they are all quiet. No one complains. That's okay. It's the same for a bus, or when the trains don't run properly, which happens more often than it should in Sweden today as a result of the decline in proper infrastructure and maintenance. People just shrug their shoulders and they accept it. The other societies I know, there would be turmoil. The people would be up in arms. They would shout, they would complain. Swedes go along. They pretend this is the usual thing. And I think it relates to that confidence and trust that the state fixes matters, and you just go with the flow. So coming back to your question or the core of our conversation, Dag Hammarskjöld was the prototype of a Swedish civil servant of the first half of the 20th century. And this socialization and internalization of values translated into the way he defined his mandate as Secretary General of the United Nations.
How complicated was it for him during his time at the United Nations to be able to really get anything done or be able to focus on anything? I mean, you have a lot of things going on that I don't think a lot of people understood at the time, like especially with our American governments, things like regime change, business interests in other countries that were being mandated by a couple higher ups. So I'm just curious how Dag Hammarskjöld was able to keep those core values or try and do things when that doesn't fit the model of a lot of people in our government at the time.
When Dag Hammarskjöld arrived in New York to take over the office from his predecessor, the Norwegian Lee, Lee welcomed him with the words, "Welcome to the most impossible job in this world." That was the time where the Cold War escalated. Now, from today's perspective, with the world falling apart, it would be maybe a bit unrealistic to say this was the worst case scenario. We have since then developed even worse scenarios. And I often ask myself, how would Dag Hammarskjöld have managed or handled the situations today? And I'm not coming to any helpful, clear conclusion. But having said that, the early 1950s were difficult enough. And Hammarskjöld had to navigate the ship called United Nations between the Scylla and Charybdis of the Western and the Eastern world, clearly separated in two conflicting camps. But it was also the time of decolonization, when the wind of change started to blow, especially over the African continent, whereas from the mid-1950s, most of African states until the mid-1960s obtained national sovereignty from the former colonial states. So you also had the situation and the challenge to take on board new United Nations member states. When he started, the number was rather limited, mainly to the West and Asia and a few Latin American states. With the new countries, the number of member states by the early 1960s, I guess, I didn't look up the figures, I guess already had doubled. Not yet the more than 190 member states we have today, which were also, of course, accelerated through the collapse of the Soviet Union with the new nation states, which were then institutionalized. But the times of the 1950s were really demanding a lot of navigating skills, a lot of diplomacy. And Hammarskjöld became Secretary General because he was totally unknown to those who had the decisive say in appointing the Secretary General, meaning the permanent members of the UN Security Council. There were several rounds where when the Security Council discussed who should replace the Norwegian Lee, who was boycotted from the Soviet Union and therefore had to be replaced during his second term in office. And all of the candidates where the names popped up were dismissed, either by the West or by the East, because they felt that's a partisan candidate who is biased. Until the moment where the French ambassador to the UN, who was aware of Dag Hammarskjöld, who at the time was the head of the Swedish permanent mission of the United Nations, said, "So what about Monsieur Hammarskjöld?" And there was quite some silence reportedly in the Security Council because they all said, "Who?" And then they took note of Sweden being a neutral country, of Hammarskjöld having a long established track record as a reliable civil servant in Sweden who never stuck out politically, that they felt, okay, in the sense that he will do what we tell him.
Yeah.
So let's agree and make Dag Hammarskjöld the next Secretary General of the United Nations. which came totally out of the blue for him. When he was informed on that, it was the 1st of April, 1953. And his first reaction was to laugh because he thought it's an April Fool's joke, until he realized that was serious. And he then consulted for a few hours. He consulted with his Swedish prime minister. He consulted with his father, I believe, who was still alive, before he reluctantly finally accepted. And then it turned out that the permanent five of the Security Council could not have been more wrong in their assessment of Dag Hammarskjöld. So at the beginning, a lot of people wondered, who is he and what might he bring about? And then he had a major, almost triumphant success, which nobody had expected. It was the time when China, which was not yet a member of the Security Council, because it was the later Taiwan who was the member in the Security Council, that the People's Republic of China had captured pilots from the US Army in the North Korean War. And the USA tasked the United Nations, and through the United Nations, the Secretary General, to negotiate the release of these prisoners of war. And Dag Hammarskjöld reportedly, as far as can be reconstructed today, went to China on a visit, officially declaring this is not a visit to negotiate the release of the prisoners of war. And he engaged in long conversations with the then President Zhou Enlai on culture, on religion, on art, on all sorts of things. Reportedly not even mentioning the US-American prisoners of war, despite the fact that everyone knew on all sides that it was ultimately about the prisoners of war. And at his next birthday, he received a card from Zhou Enlai congratulating him on the birthday. And he said, and by the way, today we release the US-American pilots. So reading between the lines, it was the Chinese birthday gift and meaning approval of Dag Hammarskjöld. That created and established his reputation as a genius when it comes to diplomacy. Diplomacy in a way where you don't tackle issues by taking them at the horns. You do it in a much more subtle way, which seeks to give recognition to the other side in the negotiations, and thereby creating a level playing field. You're not coming and claiming you know better than the other, which opens ears and eyes of the other side and most likely creates more willingness to meet the shared goal. So that release of the US-American pilots is considered as the ultimate breakthrough of Dag Hammarskjöld, and basically giving him this reputation as Secretary General.
Did it change the minds? Oh, I'm sorry. Did it change the minds of any of the other UN members, the way he was thinking and he was able to get things done? It seems like everyone kind of probably had their own ideas and values of how to get certain things done. But if you have one guy coming in and actually being successful at something that I would consider to be a major breakthrough, then it has to leak off onto some of the other members to maybe think maybe we should either follow some of his values or we should at least consider some of his strategies.
It gave him incredible authority, but it's not easy to copy such an approach. This approach relies on internalized habitus. So even if you are impressed that he managed to negotiate that, it doesn't mean you can just copy it. if you're not ticking the same way, you won't be able to do it. I mean, don't underestimate those you are negotiating with. They are able to read you. And if you try to pretend to be like Hammarskjöld, it would be very obvious rather sooner than later that you pretend to be like Hammarskjöld, but that you are not a Hammarskjöld. But interesting enough, the authority he got was also one which made him extremely popular among his staff at the United Nations. And another of his typical attitudes was when he started in the United Nations building, he started in the basement, walked up to the highest floor, and he greeted each and every UN servant, shaking hands, exchanging words. All of them, with no exemption. So he established immediately also personal contact and interaction. And until the very day, Hammarskjöld, to a certain degree, has remained legendary as Secretary General in the United Nations. Staff at the United Nations admire the role model Dag Hammarskjöld. It's very vibrant, and I experienced this during the years at the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. That was a social asset. It was a brand. It was a trademark. If you tell people you represent the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and they are related or familiar with the UN system, they immediately take it as a positive sign. I'm not sure that this would happen with any other of the Secretary Generals. So this breakthrough was fundamental, and it gave him certainly also more authority when entering other negotiations. And the next major success was the way he was able to solve the Suez Crisis of 1956, where again the constellation was that one would say, this is impossible to solve. Just to quickly recap, what happened was that the Egyptian government tried to nationalize the Suez Canal, which caused a major uproar in France and Great Britain, under whose control the Suez Canal was. So they, together with Israel, plotted an interference in Egypt to occupy the banks of the Suez Canal and to prevent the nationalization of the Suez Canal. That was brought to the Security Council because it was in violation of the UN Charter to enter Egyptian sovereign territory. But in that situation, how do you bring about a United Nations resolution which authorizes the Secretary General, who had asked for that, to take over a mandate to find a solution? Well, at the same time, both the Soviet Union and the United States of America were interested in further market liberalization of the world trade, which was very much still affected by the direct colonial and post-colonial ties of Great Britain and France with large other parts of the world. So negotiating this behind closed doors prior to a resolution, draft resolution submitted in the Security Council, Hammarskjöld achieved that Tunisia, as a temporary member of the Security Council, then considered neither in the camp of the West nor in the camp of the East, a draft resolution to offer the Secretary General a mandate, which was then supported by a yes vote by both the Soviet Union and the United States of America. which basically made it impossible for France and Great Britain to veto a draft resolution supported by the United States of America. So those two withheld their votes. And by that, the resolution was adopted, and Dag Hammarskjöld was tasked to find a solution for the Suez crisis. And he created the first Blue Helmet mission of the United Nations, based on recommendations by the then Canadian Foreign Minister, Pearson, who had suggested a similar construction to appoint a force, a United Nations force, the so-called Blue Helmets, delegate them, send them physically located in the territory to supervise a transition. And that was the decisive step to solve, at least for decades, not permanently, but for decades, the so-called Suez crisis. And France and Britain had to withdraw, Israel had to withdraw, and the Suez Canal remained an Egyptian possession. So that was the next striking effort of Dag Hammarskjöld, which does not mean he was always successful, because in parallel, the invasion of Hungary by the Soviet Union happened in 1956. And Hammarskjöld felt the same urge that the United Nations should get a mandate to intervene because it was in clear violation of the UN Charter. And he didn't get that mandate because the Soviet Union and its allies and Hungary, as the government who got the Soviet support, claimed this would be an interference in internal affairs. And Dag Hammarskjöld reacted very frustrated and bitter for being denied the opportunity to seek a solution to the invasion of Hungary.
Do you believe that any of the failures or maybe non-managed agreements Dag Hammarskjöld couldn't get done, do you believe that stuck in his head at all? Do you believe it deterred him from his goal or his purpose, or maybe kind of like, I mean, after a while, if you're so successful and word starts spreading around, you start to get a bit of a myth around you. And I would feel like, after some failures, it's hard, especially after you've had so much success or you've done things where people would think would be unthinkable.
Well, the failures happened in situations where it would have been very difficult, if not impossible, for anyone else to achieve something more. So I don't think it did ultimately damage in any serious way his reputation. The mystification was already on. With the release of the prisoners of war by China and the Suez crisis, the way he handled it, he became mystified. And the way he defined his office and the number of occasions where he used his office for public fundamental speeches. He was one who spoke many times, very often to students at universities all over the world. And his speeches and writings and statements in the UN are compiled in a total of 4 volumes, edited by 2 higher-ranking members of the United Nations system at the time. 4 volumes adding to 1,200 pages of texts by Dag Hammarskjöld. In addition to everything he did every day to seek conflict solution, to negotiate nuclear disarmament, which was also one of the major tasks in the 1950s. And he was meeting controversy and criticism from all sides more often than not. But again, it added to his reputation to be a person of integrity and honesty who did not take sides with the West or the East. In today's jargon, I would call him an anti-hegemonic Secretary General. And it's very interesting. He fell in disgrace by John F. Kennedy in the very early months of Kennedy's resuming of office, because of the Congo situation, where Hammarskjöld was seeking a solution which was not perceived as being in line with Western interests. And there was a very harsh response by J.F. Kennedy. But when the news broke about his killing in Dola, John F. Kennedy called him the most important statesman of the 20th century. So even given the conflict they had, did not prevent Hammarskjöld, John F. Kennedy, to give this recognition to Dag Hammarskjöld. And this shows that despite being not in agreement with him all the time, people were willing to give him recognition and paid him respect for the positions he held. Now, while I've said that, I should also add, while there are some who turn him into a saint and an ultimate hero, which I think is indeed a bit too generous, there are also others who called him a Machiavelli in international politics, who accused him of being calculating, of being cold-hearted, of being arrogant. I think, like so often, the truth is somewhere in between and tending, in my view, and I'm biased as the former director of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, tending more into the direction of giving him the recognition he deserves. But if you are a skilled diplomat, you have to rationalize how to shift, how to influence discourses, how best to take others on board. If you call that Machiavelli, I'm not so sure if that is fair, especially not in the way the connotation was made. But Hammarskjöld had, of course, rationality as a guiding principle. And he was determined to seek the best possible solutions. And I mentioned much earlier in our conversation that if a detour requires some flexibility where you not put aside the fundamental principles you believe in, but basically say, let them come into the picture at a later stage again, then Hammarskjöld was the one who was prepared and willing to do so. And he made quite a number of mistakes. He was perceived as distanced, as aloof, even arrogant, which I think is a misreading of his personality.
About to say, you mentioned he doesn't compromise. That could be seen as arrogant.
Well, not the compromise, but the way he behaved in personal interactions, which then cool, measured, controlled, showing no emotions, hardly ever. There are a few occasions where he showed emotions, but otherwise that was not visible. And that again relates to the Swedish human behavior of the early 20th century, where one of the paradigms was an individual is not supposed to stick out. No matter who you are, no matter what you do never pretend that you are better than others, which then at times, like in the case of Hammarskjöld, most likely caused a retreat. Some people called him a Capricorn, and I think that captures it rather well. He was detached from social interaction. He loved to discuss art and literature. He had a wide range of friends, of artists, sculptors, painters, novelists. One of his closest friends was John Steinbeck. They exchanged numerous letters. He had serious conversations with philosophers. So he was a person who was very interested in all those things, but his appearance in public events seemed always a little bit detached, even if he was talking then on subjects which disclosed a very intimate knowledge, where you would even be able to say such intimate knowledge also requires empathy and emotions, because that's not only a rational, cool knowledge. It's a knowledge based on the willingness and ability to understand and listen and follow opinions and acts of others. But in the way he appeared, people felt he's detached, he is cool, he is not the likable person you would want to have. And maybe you could even argue that might be another one of the repertoires of being a diplomat who has to negotiate with a variety of very different interests and persons and personalities, because that makes you actually even better to operationalize with people of different attitudes and behaviors, because you don't display a specific attitude and behavior which people immediately feel positively affected or negatively.
Do you believe it's also because of his values that he could not be influenced by other people? If you're negotiating something, or if you're trying to bring, let's use an example as like peace, or if you're trying to bring independence, a lot of people want something out of that, or what can I get out of this? Not just for the country's better sake, but it seemed like Dag Hammarskjöld only cared about the country's sake. What can these people, how can we bring them up to our level, our stage? If we talk about bringing independence for certain countries. But when we talk about powers that are already influencing those countries and like the way that it's going, especially in the American government that was involved in so many countries overseas, there you can't influence Dag Hammarskjöld. I mean, from what I'm learning about him, he just seems like a man that didn't have any. You can't give him a bribe. You can't say, "Hey, do you mind putting this in there so I can get a little bit of something?" Hammarskjöld wasn't about that. He was generally interested in making sure that these people could have the same kind of effort and strength as other people have gotten to. And I think that that influential factor that wasn't there, that he couldn't be influenced by other politicians or anything, that's a problem for a lot of people that would see him now as a threat. I mean, everything you could be taken as soft on communism. That hype up on communism was like one of the most dangerous things back then.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty fair assessment. Very interesting. I never thought about it like that. That's the nice thing about such a conversation, that you come up with perspectives I really never thought about. This is very much an impromptu conversation. I had not prepared, I must say. Yeah, I think it might be very applicable, and there is actually a sad example of that. And that's the inability to solve the Congo crisis, not only because of his premature death. I think it would have been extremely difficult, if at all possible, to solve the Congo crisis unfolding in the late 50s and early 1960s. But one of the sad aspects of that was his inability to relate with empathy to Patrice Lumumba as the president of the independent state of the Congo, who was then discharged by a coup, and where Hammarskjöld, as we know from correspondence and records, actually did not manage to get along with Lumumba, because he felt Lumumba is driven by nationalism, which does not help to find a solution to the situation. He was very, very shocked, if not traumatized, by the assassination of Lumumba. And he immediately declared, actually in a letter to John Steinbock, he said, that's the worst case that could happen, because there is no solution for the Congo without the direct involvement of Patrice Lumumba. But again, even that argument confirms the thinking in terms of finding a solution not necessarily in terms of ultimate human empathy with a victim. And that constellation made it almost impossible for him to enter a meaningful personal relationship with a person like Patrice Lumumba, because he felt he is erratic, he is too spontaneous, you can't rely on what he says. And there were incidences where one could say that confirms that assessment. But of course, there are other aspects you could consider bringing into the picture. That Patrice Lumumba, as a nationalist, was ousted from office, was desperate to get back into office for the sake of the Congo and the people. That was the time when there was the secession of Katanga as the richest province in terms of natural resources of the Congo. So you could also have put on a perspective from the point of view of Patrice Lumumba, and then you would have come to a different assessment of the situation. And you could say maybe that was one of the limitations of Hammarskjöld as a diplomat in the office. But then again, if the alternative would be that you're driven by empathy in finding solutions, would that be a strategy which would stand better chances in negotiating with conflicting, contradicting, and sometimes even entirely antagonistic interests? Most likely not. But let me add another aspect to kind of demystify Hammarskjöld. He made a lot of mistakes when appointing people to offices. And he was criticized for that by quite a number of people close to him who really admired him, but who said sometimes he is just guided by personal preferences, not looking at the bigger picture. And that meant if he was impressed by a person because that person was interested in art, knew a lot of literature, spoke different languages, then it created an affirmative attitude to the person, which kind of blinded him when it came to the limitations of the very same person tasked to execute an office. And again, in the Congo crisis, he made appointments which were really bad appointments. So you also had this side of Hammarskjöld where his own personal interest in all those many things influenced his decisions in a rather unhealthy manner.
What do they say? The biggest enemy is yourself.
Well, and Hammarskjöld in his markings, the book posthumously published, his notebook, which I think is not a very good title. Maybe Waymarks would have been a much better translation of the Swedish title of the book. But in markings, he, among other things, that the longest journey is the journey inside. And maybe he should have had more time to continue this journey inside, to improve even what has already been quite a good performance.
Can I ask about the crash? What your thoughts are on it, what your belief is on it? I know the government, it was the Rhodesian government and the British government on the first investigation. I think they put in pilot error, but it's been reopened and reinvestigated multiple times over. From talking with Greg Polgrain, probably would lean more towards the Alan Dulles aspect or Hoover, someone that felt like they had either a financial interest in Indonesia or something that was going on that Dag Hammarskjöld was just stepping on top of that maybe he just wasn't aware of. Because you got to think he's focused on his morals and beliefs and trying to do his mission. The business aspect sometimes that can get overlooked. I mean, we don't know half of the things we're finding out 50 years after the fact. But I do think with the plane crash, there is a little bit of myth and there's a little bit of like fact. I know that people talked about him having an ace of spades in his shirt collar. I don't know so much about that. I just know that it was very strange circumstances. The fact that tower logs were taken when that would give us some evidence on certain things. And also, there was one person that survived only for, I think, the next 24 hours, maybe a little less. And he talked about hearing an explosion. And it just makes a lot of sense because back then you had Hale Boggs' plane crash or disappearance that nobody knows after he calls out J. Edgar Hoover in a press conference talking about his resignation. There's so much going on where I've learned more about the dark stuff, and I'm not trying to be conspiracy here, but these are real issues. Lumumba was kind of allowed to be killed. It happened from Eisenhower before Kennedy even took office. And there's a lot of things I think even the United Nations has questioned at a point where it's like, could this be foul play? Could this be something darker? It doesn't have to be the Rhodesian government or any type of mysterious aircraft that shot at him. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the crash and who you might suspect or what you might think about the more foul play aspects.
Well, first of all, you don't need to be a fan of conspiracy theories to reach the conclusion based on relevant evidence we have today that something fishy was going on, suggesting that the crash of the plane in the night from the 17th to the 18th of September 1961, close to approaching the airport of Dola in then northern Rhodesia, a mining town bordering to the Congo, was not accidental. And it's very interesting that within days, actually the next day, former US American President Roosevelt told the New York Times that Dag Hammarskjöld was killed.
Was it Roosevelt or was it Truman?
Truman, sorry,
Yeah,
Truman.
he stated to the press, he said he was on the verge of getting something done when they killed him. Notice how I said they killed him.
And actually, to leave no doubts, he added, take note of what I said.
Yeah.
So from the very moment the crash was reported, there were doubts. What happened then was that there were different official commissions of investigation. A North Rhodesian one, a Swedish one, and a United Nations one. And while the North Rhodesian one, seconded by the Swedish one, concluded that it most likely has been a pilot's error, the United Nations Commission submitted a report in 1962, not excluding any of 3 or 4 different reasons for the crash. And they included external influence. And most importantly, the United Nations General Assembly adopted then a resolution which said, if there is significant new evidence, it could be decided that the investigations are reopened. That opened the door for exactly doing that more than 50 years later. In 2011, 50 years after the crash, the Zambian British historian Susan Williams presented a pioneering book, Who Killed Dag Hammarskjöld? And while she falls short of giving verifiable answers, she presents a wide range of evidence pointing into the direction of foul play. Most importantly, which also remains one of the main arguments now, the negligence of a significant number of African eyewitnesses in the reports of that night, who were all dismissed by being natives unreliable, against the West, making up things. These were independent of each other, several reports, which all pointed in the same direction, that there was another plane close to the Albertina, the DC-6 plane in which Hammarskjöld and 15 others were on board, in the air. And they saw flashes in the air and an explosion. What happened after that book was presented by Susan Williams, that a private initiative was formed by a handful of people calling themselves an enabling committee. That was in 2012. And they tasked 4 internationally renowned legal experts and jurists to examine the evidence presented in Susan Williams' book. And they did so on a pro bono basis for 1 year, and then submitted their independent report at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And their conclusion was that in most of the evidence presented was probative value, that this was the case. Legally, a very important term, probative value. So that report was then, by the chairperson of the enabling committee, submitted to the Secretary General of the United Nations, at that time Ban Ki-moon. He asked his legal experts in the Secretariat to look at that report. Those legal experts concluded that they agree with the findings of that report, that there is sufficient probative value in some of the evidence which would merit the reopening of the investigations. And Ban Ki-moon submitted the proposal to the UN Secretary General Assembly, and then the Swedish government submitted a draft resolution to the General Assembly when that report was discussed, which suggested that another group of legal experts appointed is looking into further evidence. That was adopted. Then the legal experts reported back. That must have been 2015 or 16. And then again, they confirmed that there is sufficient reason to believe that it was not an accident. And again, Sweden submitted another draft resolution adopted by the General Assembly to appoint an eminent person tasked with further investigations. And that was the retired Chief Justice of Tanzania, Judge Othman, who was also one of the 4 members of the legal expert group tasked by the Secretary General. Judge Othman has since then submitted 2 reports, and in each case got an extension of the mandate to undertake further investigations, because one of the major problems he was facing and is still facing is non-compliance of member states offering access to documents believed to be shelved away as secret documents in archives, especially in the USA and in Great Britain. And both countries have not provided access to these documents believed to be there. One of the most important demands or suggestions already by that independent group of legal experts was that at the time when the Albertina crashed, there were several planes of the US posted in Dola awaiting the plane of Dag Hammarskjöld. And they all had the means to record the air traffic. And they suggested access to the records of the air traffic then would be the first step to establish if something was going on shortly before the plane crashed. And these air traffic reports have until the very day not been released. That makes you, of course, wonder, why is that the case? Judge Ottman has to submit another report in a few weeks from now, in July or August latest, which then, being looked at by the Secretary General, will then be shared by all the UN member states. And then this report and Judge Ottman's recommendations will be discussed again, most likely at the very end of this year in the General Assembly. It remains to be seen, in the absence of decisive new insights, given this blocked situation that there is no access to what is considered to be relevant documentation in some of the archives, if the mandate of Judge Ottman is extended another time. But what can be taken for granted at the situation as of now is that Judge Ottman, as the eminent person, assumes that the plane was brought down by external direct or indirect influence. So even if, due to the constellation and the difficulty to get access to further relevant evidence, the investigations would again come to an end, the situation has changed. The overwhelming perception today is that this was not a pilot's error and it was not an accident. And most importantly, among others, the Swedish government revised the findings of the 1961-62 Swedish Commission's report by following that assessment and thereby rehabilitating the crew on board of the plane. The relatives of these pilots and other crew members were stigmatized all the time because of the assumption it was their error that brought down the plane and did not only kill them, but all others on board of the plane. So at least as a small comfort, this has been accomplished, that the families of the crew on board of the plane received a rehabilitation of those fathers, brothers, uncles close to them who were killed in that crash. It's not possible at the moment, and that is where one should be hesitant to enter conspiracy theories, to clearly allocate individual responsibilities. Had Hoover something in it, like when it comes to the assassination of Lumumba or any of the two Dulles brothers? It's possible. Given their roles at the time, it's something one should not dismiss, but it's not possible at the moment to offer watertight proof of that. Many tend into the direction that maybe that bringing down of the plane was not in the first place a clearly planned assassination attempt, but it was an interference which went utterly wrong. And it was executed by one of the mercenaries on board of a plane which came from Katanga. That's the most likely assumption, but again, it's not proven. But Ottman is eager in his reports to point out that the means existed, both in terms of airports and planes and pilots who could have executed that.
I am very light touch with the word conspiracy because I do study and kind of look into the JFK thing. Only on the basis of this. Same thing with Dag Hammarskjöld. A search party was not sent out until a lot later than it should have been. Flight logs were missing. There's very basic things where even if you can't come up with foul play that somebody was involved in essentially taking the plane down, there were things and protocols that were not followed and things that are very suspicious evidence where has gone either missing or was neglected or was delayed, and that is the culpability there. So when we talk about like the facts of the matter, the foul play aspect, that's not how, I mean, the search party getting sent out way later, that's a very big problem on that government. They had a responsibility to do that and go search for them, and they didn't until the morning. So it's, again, it's when we say conspiracy and stuff like that, it's basically just pointing out the facts of like, this is not normal what you guys did. You know, you have to accept the culpability in that. You are essentially responsible. So that's where I stand on some things. I don't know if there was a plane that shot at him. I don't know if it was resistance fighters. I don't know if it was Alan Dulles or any of those. But I just believe that there was a lot of things that he was doing that were essentially good for humankind and for a lot of people. And that does not flow with the mentality of the Cold War. And I think it just gives more weight to the argument and the importance of his life as well, too. There's been very few people in history that have been forward thinkers, trying to usher in a new era. And a lot of those people are got taken out in really weird circumstances. So it's you have to kind of weigh those options there.
Absolutely, and it started right after midnight. Ndola Airport received a message that the plane is approaching the airport to land. And then was silence. And what did they do? They closed down the airport and went home with the argument, oh, they might have changed plans and redirected the plane to land somewhere else. What?
They didn't think the call or anything like it.
And then, as you say, they started in the next morning to send out a search team into the opposite direction of where the plane was supposed to approach. Meanwhile, there are reliable, multiple eyewitness reports, not only from so-called natives, which were discriminated as being unreliable, but also white passers-by who saw that already in the morning there was the site of the crash cordoned off and access denied. But the official discovery was only in the afternoon, when they then rescued the still alive bodyguard of Hammarskjöld, who was lying for hours and hours in the burning sun and was brought to a local hospital, where again the evidence suggests he died after 2 or 3 days due to negligence and improper treatment, because his life even then could still have been saved. And what he was saying was dismissed as being something of someone who was in a semi-coma, not reliable. So you can start from after midnight of the crash, and you say it all adds up to such a series of contradictions, inconsistencies, and unexplained deliberate efforts to cover up, that it's very difficult to believe that this was a plain accident.
Mr. Melber, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show about some of this stuff, especially about the life of Dag Hammarskjöld. I will definitely have you back on again to discuss more about him. Can you please promote anywhere where people can find any of your links? I know you have an Amazon for where your books are, but if you have website, anything in relation?
Well, I myself published a book on Dag Hammarskjöld and the decolonization of Africa. It's still available through Hearst Publishing in London and Oxford University Press for the USA. If listeners or viewers want to Google Melber and Hammarskjöld, they will also find a number of open access journal articles relating to the subject. I can strongly recommend still the book of Susan Williams of 2011, Who Killed Hammarskjöld, again with Hearst, with a revised second updated edition of 2016 or so, which is still available. And there are numerous other online information sources. If someone Googles the UN Association of Westminster in London, they have a separate site on Hammarskjöld where they meticulously document everything that is happening with regard to the continued investigations, where the reports of Judge Ottman are accessible for download, where other articles, where other events, like the last one, end of February, in London at the Institute for Commonwealth Studies, a day seminar discussing the current situation when it comes to the investigations, where all these documents and all the inputs presented then are accessible. So, and further reference to other books, of course. Then there is maybe the ultimate biography of Dag Hammarskjöld, only called Hammarskjöld by Roger Lipsey. Lipsey. So Googling Lipsey and Hammarskjöld, and Roger Lipsey has their own website where he also offers additional information. Off the cuff, that's most of the things that come to my mind.
And if you think of anything else and want to send it to me in email, I'll make sure I link it in the description so people can be able to check it out and see some valuable resources. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being able to discuss this with me. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next